When scholars describe the upheaval of revolutionary France in 1792, they typically focus on the chaos below, the violent purges of September, the collapse of royal authority, and the radical passion that engulfed the capital. However, the real chronicle, conspicuously missing from official documents and buried deep within dusty archives, took place high above the streets. In the bell towers, it began with a simple government decree. Laborers across the nation were commanded to strip bells from religious buildings, grand cathedrals, and municipal towers throughout France, all for bronze recovery to fuel the machinery of war. As the new republic braced for conflict against royalist armies, the mission seemed purely practical. Seize the bronze, melt it down, and determine whether these metals could satisfy the revolution's urgent demand for artillery and coinage. Yet the moment workers began dismantling bells from Notre Dame and other ancient monuments, something unexpected emerged. They uncovered mechanisms that had been hidden for hundreds of years. Inside tower rooms, at elevations rarely documented in maintenance logs, the crews discovered acoustic installations and resonance devices that matched no known bell-hanging tradition. The arrangement was unusual, the intricacy was extraordinary, and the craftsmanship resembled nothing found in contemporary foundry manuals. It didn't align with French techniques, or Italian campanology, or anything conventionally understood. This information never made its way into official revolutionary announcements. It never reached the newspapers celebrating the Republic's victories. But in that year's internal records, one particular phrase appears again and again: unexpected apparatus, extraordinary sophistication, function unknown. The official narrative would later dismiss all of this as ordinary bell infrastructure, obsolete clock parts, or simply ornamental stonework. Nothing unusual, nothing worth investigating. But the dismantling logs from that era, the ones processed in secure government facilities while Paris rejoiced in its newfound freedom, tell a different story. They describe workers standing beside copper tubes, manufactured with precision far exceeding anything metalwork of that period should have achieved. Components fitted so flawlessly that even through crude Revolutionary-era illustrations, their advanced nature is unmistakable. Patterns of wound metal and geometric cavities that bear no resemblance to any documented European bell tradition, but something far older, more mathematical, more deliberate. And the deeper they went, the less it resembled campanology as we know it, and the more it resembled technology that had been operated, serviced, and intentionally hidden. At first, the removal teams tried to explain everything in simple terms: ornate bell mounts, abandoned tower equipment, decorative metalwork from previous restorations. But as documentation accumulated and more installations were exposed in towers throughout Paris, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were certain acoustic chambers constructed with dimensions creating perfect harmonic resonance at particular frequencies? Why were specific copper spirals organized in geometric formations, as if engineered for energy transfer rather than sound amplification? Why did some conduits extend deep into the tower masonry, far beyond where any bell mechanism should reach? And the question that troubled even the most conventional workers: why were these installations so massive? The bell seizure required detailed inventories, yet the acoustic infrastructure inside portions of Notre Dame, Sainte-Chapelle, and countless parish churches appeared built for something entirely different than summoning congregations to worship. Removal teams privately admitted among themselves that the scale and complexity didn't match any architectural or foundry records. And while none of them used phrases like lost technology, they were witnessing something equally unsettling. Someone had built these systems long ago, not bells, not musical instruments, but power systems. As documentation grew, so did the silence. Reports became shorter, descriptions grew vague, sketches stopped showing the full scope of the mechanisms, and then, in late 1792, the tower chambers were partially resealed, What remained was secured for structural purposes, and much of what had been revealed was stripped away and melted down. Only fragments survive today. Documentation, a handful of technical sketches, and the quiet testimonies of archivists who examined the files before some mysteriously disappeared. But even from what remains, a pattern is visible. Systems too advanced for any documented bell installation, engineering too precise for the accepted timeline, construction methods that seem inherited, infrastructure that appears to come from an entirely different technological era. When removal crews climbed beyond the accessible levels in Paris's towers, expectations were straightforward. They'd find standard bell-hanging equipment, maybe some abandoned clock gears, scattered remnants from earlier renovations. Nothing strange, nothing remarkable. But within weeks, those assumptions were shattered. Because instead of a simple arrangement of bells and supports, the crews encountered a series of acoustic chambers that didn't function the way cathedral tower spaces are supposed to function. The first anomaly was the tuning. Every tower, Notre Dame, Saint Sulpice, Saint Ander, and dozens more, appeared to maintain identical fundamental resonance frequencies. The same harmonic intervals, the same geometric layout. Different churches, different builders, different centuries shouldn't have that. Different architects, different foundries, different eras. They don't build in perfect acoustic alignment with structures erected generations apart, yet across Paris, they did. Resonance chambers from one cathedral were designed to amplify frequencies that matched perfectly with chambers in another church a kilometer away. Acoustic passages aligned with passages in completely separate districts. Bell chambers maintain identical dimensional ratios, even when built in vastly different architectural styles. It was as if every tower ever raised above Paris was copying a master frequency blueprint, one that no longer exists in any architectural record. As workers climbed higher, the chambers grew stranger. Above the expected bell platforms and support beams, they began finding metalwork that looked nothing like bell-hanging apparatus. Far more elaborate coils, much tighter geometric configurations, arrangements that seemed too mathematically exact for anything in documented European campanology. Some chambers appeared almost excessive, copper-lined spaces with flawless acoustic reflection, executed with accuracy that didn't match the primitive metalworking of any known period. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most traditional members of the removal crews. Crystalline deposits. Mineral formations coating metal surfaces, substances crystallized in patterns that only form under prolonged vibrational exposure at specific frequencies. Yet there's no historical record of these towers producing anything beyond standard bell tones. No documentation of continuous acoustic operation at the intensity needed to create such formations. Nothing explains why large sections of the tower chambers look as though they've been subjected to sustained harmonic resonance for centuries, perhaps millennia. Removal sketches from 1792 show this clearly. Workers standing beside coiled mechanisms so intricate that the men appear primitive by comparison. Copperwork was manufactured so precisely that even modern electrical engineers study the archival drawings in astonishment. Geometric arrangements and acoustic chambers resembling technological installations far more sophisticated than anything revolutionary France is credited with. But the most disturbing detail wasn't what appeared in the documentation. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports written in the years after the confiscation barely mention these features. Some illustrations omit the most complex chambers entirely. Certain systems are reduced with vague language like decorative elements or architectural ornaments, even though the sketches show they were far more elaborate than that. The silence is hard to ignore. Because if these tower systems truly belonged to known bell founding traditions, why weren't they documented in detail? Why weren't the unusual acoustic mechanisms recorded thoroughly? Why were the technical drawings scattered across revolutionary archives instead of compiled into a single metallurgical assessment. Even some copper components presented problems. Geometric patterns too precise, surfaces too refined, crystalline deposits too consistent, formations that looked less like natural corrosion and more like the byproduct of sustained energy transmission. Transmission that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those towers were supposedly built. What the removal crews uncovered were systems that didn't fit French bell founding, didn't fit Italian campanology, and didn't even fit each other in traditional terms. Instead, they formed a strange technological language, one that seemed to span multiple periods, yet somehow remained unified, harmonically synchronized, and impossibly precise. The first shock came with the chambers themselves. These weren't simple bell platforms or basic acoustic spaces. They were geometrically perfect chambers. Rooms shaped with exact harmonic proportions, copper-lined surfaces that maintained their reflective quality flawlessly across centuries, and acoustic systems arranged with coherence, almost like the remnants of a master frequency network that no longer exists in any archive. Some chambers were completely sealed, filled with material so dense that workers assumed they'd hit solid stone. But when breached, they revealed interiors that seemed untouched since the moment they were closed. Polished copper surfaces, geometric coil patterns, and acoustic configurations that raised more questions than answers. And then came the feature that still baffles researchers today: the enormous spherical metal housings. Officially, they were later classified as bell casings, or decorative architectural elements. But nothing about them matches typical bell design or ornamental metalwork. These were too perfectly spherical, too precisely dimensioned, too flawlessly balanced, as if they were manufactured with tools capable of maintaining perfect geometry. Some resonators were large enough to contain a full-sized bell inside their hollow interiors. Others were solid metal with internal cavity structures, almost like housings for harmonic oscillators or frequency amplification devices. Workers from 1792 described them in private letters as manufactured spheres, not bells, but geometric forms with an acoustic purpose, though nobody could specify what that purpose might have been. Another oddity emerged in how certain copper systems were arranged. These weren't just supporting bells from above. Many were configured in spiral patterns that made no architectural sense, descending through tower walls, interconnected between chambers, or positioned around the spherical resonators in geometric arrays. It raised an unsettling possibility. The bells above might not just be there to call the faithful. They might have served as the visible parts of something much larger, a system whose true scale was never documented, never taught, and never explained in the official history of European architecture. The deeper the workers went, the stranger the discoveries became. Copper components with completely uniform dimensions. Some surfaces polished to mirror finishes, refined, almost reflective. Others show precision geometric patterns so exact that modern metallurgists still debate what tools could have created them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the crystalline structures embedded within the copper itself. Some formations appeared resonant, vibrational, frequency-aligned. Yet they were found in systems supposedly older than any acoustic science sophisticated enough to produce such results. The official explanation given later: natural mineral deposits, corrosion patterns. But that doesn't account for why the crystals appear within the copper in patterns, not randomly scattered, but aligned, geometric, and organized, as if the metal had been exposed to specific frequencies over extended periods. That kind of result requires vibrational exposure far beyond bell ringing, far beyond any musical performance, and far beyond anything documented in European architectural history. Shortly after these discoveries, something strange began happening. Chambers were stripped of their mechanisms, systems were dismantled, Complex portions of the installations were removed from the towers entirely. Some of this was officially labeled as metal reclamation, necessary to support the Revolutionary War effort, but the decisions about which systems to remove first and which components to melt down immediately raised quiet questions among witnesses, because the mechanisms that were destroyed quickly were always the ones that challenged the official timeline the most. The geometric resonators. The copper coil arrays. The crystalline coated systems. The acoustic chambers seemed to connect to conduits running throughout the tower structures. These conduits were perhaps the most mysterious discovery of all. They weren't random architectural features. They were parts of a systematic configuration, a network of channels that looked less like construction details and more like infrastructure. Aligned, calculated, organized, as if they once connected to a much larger harmonic network, one that linked every major tower across Paris, and, perhaps, beyond. Long before any civilization, we recognized that such systems were ever documented, and yet, almost as soon as they were revealed, many were destroyed. Their components melted down, their function unexplored, their existence quietly erased from later architectural surveys. When you examine the final months of the 1792 bell confiscations, something becomes impossible to ignore. The operation didn't end naturally. It was rushed. Not completed, not finished, rushed. The further the removal crews went, the more the nature of their documentation changed. Early entries were procedural, almost routine, but toward the end, the language becomes guarded, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be written. And this is where the real mystery begins. Because the final chambers they accessed in Paris's tallest towers weren't typical. They weren't architectural. They weren't decorative. They weren't even classifiable as bell-hanging equipment. They were something else entirely. Multiple accounts, the few that survived, described systems that suddenly shifted from the recognizable to the inexplicable. Copperwork with joints so tight you couldn't slip a blade between them. Geometric chambers formed with precision that pre-industrial France was never supposed to possess. Resonators designed for frequencies far beyond anything bells produce, and conduits that ran throughout the tower structures, disappearing into walls beneath modern construction. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most sophisticated systems were the ones that melted down first. Workers described dismantling entire chambers, removing components, and destroying installations that had only just been discovered. It wasn't gradual. It was immediate. The official explanation: metal shortage, military necessity, revolutionary urgency. But if it was only about bronze reclamation, why were the most complex, most geometrically precise, most acoustically advanced systems the ones destroyed first? And why were simple bells often left hanging, while elaborate mechanisms were prioritized for destruction? It doesn't make sense, unless those tower systems represented a different kind of threat, not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure inside Paris's towers truly showed acoustic engineering beyond pre-revolutionary capability, and if some of those systems didn't match any documented bell-founding tradition at all, then the entire accepted narrative of European technological development starts to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if Europe's grandest cathedrals were built around something far more ancient, something functional, something engineered, something we didn't construct for worship. Imagine what it means if the towers weren't just architectural achievements, but the visible parts of a continental frequency network that predates recorded history. And maybe that's why the 1792 discoveries were systematically destroyed, not to fuel the revolution, but to erase the evidence. The surviving sketches tell their own story: workers standing beside systems, that look almost technological. Geometric arrangements resembling frequency generation. Acoustic chambers are too sophisticated for their supposed era. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to mention at all. And that brings us to the final question. Why was the most sophisticated evidence, the most complex acoustic systems, the most geometrically precise infrastructure destroyed so completely? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The resonance chambers, dismantled. The geometric copper arrays, dismantled. The spherical resonators, dismantled. The frequency-aligned conduits, dismantled. The crystalline-coded systems, dismantled. And even parts of the technical documentation vanished. Almost as if the confiscation had accidentally exposed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the French monarchy, older than recorded Christianity, older than the story we were told. And for one brief moment in 1792, the towers opened enough to reveal it. But instead of studying it, they destroyed it, melted it, dismantled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Europe's great cathedrals concealed frequency generation systems built by a civilization we no longer remember, then the real question isn't what was discovered in 1792. It's what else remains hidden in the towers of the world. What other churches, what other structures, what other acoustic systems were quietly destroyed long before anyone thought to document them properly? The 1792 bell confiscation wasn't just a revolutionary metal reclamation project. It was a glimpse, a brief, accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. Thanks for watching. And if you found this intriguing, well, there are many more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.